Okay.
Class. Okay, so these charts, I mean, here we try to, in the company, we've always got these proactive kind of behavioral studies going on that's sort of like, in some senses, is a kind of an academic research wing of what we do. And there's always these things that we're trying to understand. And these 8 charts are a reflection of the way that we think human beings are making decisions. And it doesn't matter whether it's buying toothpaste in Walmart, deciding whether they should go on holiday, or how they buy Logitech VC gear. It all comes down to the same kind of things. It's particularly interesting correlations as well with how we see young people behave, because this is really an acute challenge towards young people, and that, I would say, is probably early 20s and down. Gen Alpha are really going to suffer from this in a way that nobody who's in Gen X or Gen Y will understand. So first thing,
Which one's Gen Alpha?
there'll probably be some, they wouldn't have made double figures in age yet, so 9 and
Okay.
under. 9 and under. So first chart, and the charts themselves don't overly matter, but it's what they are insinuating that becomes critical. So this looks at like the growth in world data, and the growth in world data here is super interesting because what effectively you've got is the blue, which is structured manageable data, and grey, which is unstructured data that we know is out there, but we haven't really done anything with. So for example, somebody may well be able to correlate the hours that you're on on your computer with the amount of cups of coffee that you drink and the amount of electricity that you use to find out what kind of persona you are. It's there, but we don't use it. Sports teams are, and actually most businesses are obsessed by the grey, the things that they don't know. And people are always like, oh yeah, but we need to do some research and understand that. Whereas the blue is the things that we really know what to do. And for the most part, as you'll well know, the blue data is linear in growth and the grey is exponential. We think the tipping point was about 2015. And as a research agency, after about 2015, what we found is the whole way that clients process data sort of changed. It all just became more than we can cope with. And if you extrapolate this forward to 2030, this grey bar is likely to sit somewhere between 5 and 500 times the amount of information that's available today. And what's really, really interesting, and a lot of clients say this to us now, is that they're data rich and insight poor. In other words, they've got more data than they ever know what to do with. They constantly think that something in the data is interesting, and they spend so much time looking for it. So this is why, if you look at future jobs, there's always this high demand for analysts. And the analysts effectively put their mining helmets on and they go into the grey data and they tell you something interesting. Whereas what we do here is analysis. So we create hypotheses of human truths, and then we go into the grey looking for very specific pieces of information to qualify whether that be a truth or not. Because there's no human being on planet Earth that can cope with this grey. And in fact, computers can't even cope with it because the human being needs to tell the computer which bits to look for, or you just come up with spurious correlations.
Yeah, I get you. Well, do you know what we use in product? We use a very similar graph, where the grey would be the features and functions that we're releasing, and the blue would be the features and functions that the customer can actually cope with. And that gap between the top of the blue and top of the grey we call the consumption gap, which is just, our customers are unable to process all of these extra new features that we've put in.
Correct, 100%. And that's the problem when you get to multi-functionality buttons. So what therefore happening is some engineer and some FD somewhere said, yeah, why don't we make this one button on the side of this product and we'll make it multifunction. So if you press it in once quickly, wait for the blue light to flash, then repeatedly do it 3 times, then hold it in until it turns into a long green light, unless it's red, in which case and it's like, then when you go back to a piece of 1990s tech and the buttons are dedicated because that's all that was possible. And effectively what engineers are doing are they're creating more and more confusion as the grey grows and the blue stays virtually the same.
Yeah.
So this kind of gives you a perception of the fact that the amount of data in the world is hugely complicated. And I'm not a futurist in that sense, but what I do look at is the inability of a human being to compare itself with a machine. Because now what we're doing is we're saying, oh, Google does that and this data is available, I should be good enough to figure it out. Which is why when you look at the future of jobs, all you constantly see is this demand for critical thinking. And the critical thinking and the demand of critical thinking is because so many companies now need people that can scan the blue and the grey, where traditionally careers have always been in the blue.
Yeah, okay.
And you need to be a very, very special kind of person to be able to cope with the grey. And the people that cope with the grey, generally speaking, I would say, bizarrely, have traditionally lower IQs, poorer memories, dyslexia, could be on the spectrum. And all of the reason being is that to be able to cope with the grey, you have to be able to manage or actually have the function of inattention as opposed to attention itself. So it's about being able to forget what the grey is telling you, not necessarily be obsessed by what you're missing, but what you've got.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think I've said this before. My wife's a one-to-one TA for an autistic child. He's 10, and he's very good at just clearing out the crap. He can find a way through complicated situations by just picking out something that he can see.
I think you're absolutely spot on, and there's some really interesting stuff here. So to go on a little bit, so I'm explaining it in depth, so if you pass it on to anybody, it's super easy. So then what we've looked at is, and it doesn't really overly matter that this is smartphones, but it's a very particular nuance that this creates social pressure. And when we look at a whole bunch of challenges to do with policing, government, anxiety, and depression, it nearly all links back to a camera. And Logitech is a huge part of that, insofar as you provide cameras. However, the difference with Logitech is it's not recorded and transmitted in social media in the same way that smartphones are. Smartphones are so pervasive. What effectively is happening, so smartphones outnumber toothbrushes by quite a long chalk.
Okay, interesting.
And what that basically
suppose, yeah, I've got two smartphones here and only one toothbrush.
Here you go. So they're more readily available. And what's really interesting about this is it means that people can effectively shoot a video and upload it where it immediately goes into the grey, because every piece of content is still held somewhere on a server. So our growth is becoming exponentially bigger as more people have smartphones, more people create content and put it up. And effectively what this is meaning is that anything that goes on anywhere is transmitted and distributed in real time. And that means that if somebody somewhere acts inappropriately or naughty or says something that might be slightly antagonistic, it's immediately transmitted across the world. And the problem with this is that that stuff was always going on. It's just nobody knew about it.
Yeah.
Knowing about it is hugely liberating, but also incredibly crippling in equal measure, because effectively then you start to get caught up with things that probably before you didn't even know about. And to some degree, it's a little bit like, if I didn't know that there was a hurricane in Brazil, where 30 people, really got themselves into trouble, your life would go on. But the more you know, the more it weighs on your soul and your mind.
Understood.
I'll come back to that momentarily. Rates of ADHD. So I think we talked a little bit about this before. Attention is collapsing. And the thing that's really interesting about attention is it's a scarce human resource. And the more and more kids that we talk to, particularly who are somewhere between the ages of 8 and 16, you have kids that can't concentrate in school anymore. So we've done a bunch of different research studies, and broadly speaking, adults like you and I can manage 40 minutes of concentration. Kids can manage 20 minutes, and a lot of them can only manage 10. So what that basically means is you've got a teacher who can cope with a 45 or 35-minute school lesson and a kid that can cope with a 10-minute school lesson. And you end up with such a huge differential between the two. Rates of ADHD diagnosed in the US is about 15% of school children, boys now in the US, but boys are far more likely to suffer from attention challenges. Diagnosed, undiagnosed, as much as 30%. So therefore, what you've got in the US schooling system is 1 in 3 boys can't pay attention to a teacher for more than 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Once you have that as a challenge, it basically means that stuff is going into their head. And if stuff doesn't go into their head, you end up with a huge, huge consequential challenge down the road. Because if you can't pay attention and you can't read and you can't remember things, it truly affects the way that you act as an adult. What we're finding now, and it's super interesting, is that, you know, this whole kind of like strategic ambiguity where people put terms and conditions that are 22 pages long. Nobody reads them except potentially one person in accounts. But even when we're sending briefs through to or proposals through to customers and clients, nobody reads anything anymore because their attention is so promiscuous.
It's true. It is absolutely true. The only time I've found that they read things in detail is when they've implemented the project, it's gone wrong, and they're looking to see where they can scrape something back in the scope.
And that's normally because they go straight to the end and look at the budget.
Totally, yeah.
So ultimately, and that's a very British thing as well, you know. So what you end up doing is you just go straight to the budget and go, holy shit, that's the cost, is it? Oh my God, how can I take this money off? But even then, they're only doing it on a superficial level because people don't read anything. It's also interesting as we look at this attention challenge to do with the amount of words that people read. So smartphones, and we've looked at the amount of words that people will scroll down before they give up, and lots of data can support this. But effectively, people are now used to a very narrow column with a certain degree of like 5 or 6 thumb scrolls. After that, you're done.
Okay,
so
interesting.
It's reprogramming the very way in which people pay attention and therefore absorb information. So it's becoming more and more important to understand how you do something that's punchy, quick, and to the point. And that goes back to how you end up then even working with a partner who you believe is covering off more of what you want. So it's how quickly can you get somebody to absorb a client's needs and to just go back and go, yeah, I got it, right, we do, boom, boom, boom. And they're like, sick, this guy understands it, which is empathy. Empathy normally sits on the emotional intelligence scale, which generally means that you have to be, particularly as a boy, you have to be quite a soft, gentle, compassionate guy. And soft, gentle, compassionate guys tend to be more emotionally intelligent. Emotional intelligence tends to sit at juxtapositions with technical intelligence. So generally then you have the technical guys that don't have huge amounts of empathy, who are not particularly good in those conversations or dialogues, and the empathetic guys who generally aren't as good with the technical stuff but know how to manage a relationship.
Yeah.
They rarely mix.
They do. One of my old bosses always said that there's 2 types of engineers. There's the type that don't want to see the customer, and then there's the type that you don't want to see the customer. Spot
on, 100% correct.
Yeah.
It's interesting because if you go back into biology, what you start to see is there's like, it's the way people absorb information. There's a correlation between early synaptic pruning. So there's data that suggests that there's about two stages of severe synaptic pruning in young age. So the first is kind of like just after you enter like early childhood, and the second is as you start to enter or go towards puberty, so like about age 11. And there seems to be a correlation between higher and faster rates of synaptic pruning and IQ at 11. So if you remember the 11 plus.
Yeah, I do.
And what you tend to see is that those children that are more intelligent at 11 are likely to have greater rates of synaptic pruning, higher levels of intelligence. They tend to be people like doctors, surgeons, solicitors, and they're also, there's no, there's a correlation that suggests that they also have the lower emotional intelligence.
Okay, interesting.
But they tend to be smarter and more stubborn.
I went to a boys' grammar school, and so you had to have passed the 11 plus to have got in there, and I can tell you that pretty much nails the entire population of that school. Yeah.
It's and here's the thing, it's biology. So people think that stubbornness is an acquired trait, and actually it's a biological trait. And if you start to step back and you think about it, you end up with surgeons that are completely impractical. They're if they get a flat tire, they've got no idea what to do. They don't have street smarts. But what you're seeing is this real kind of juxtaposition between those people that can cope in the blue data and in the grey data.
Okay.
So So there is biology that underpins this. Okay, so then what happens is you've got lower rates of attention, so people's attention's falling to pieces, and it brings us onto a normal distribution curve. What this basically suggests is that what happens in the middle is what is happening to most people, but on the red outside fringes is the stuff people pay attention to. Because if you want somebody who's got very limited attention, who's got lots and lots of data to see, the only way of generally catching it is to go to the things that are shocking. So what the media tends to do is it picks on the things that it knows people are going to look at. Yeah. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So when things stand out and they're distinctive, people look at them. So there's only two places that you can get attention. Number one is the top of the middle. So for example, Elon Musk is a really good example. Elon Musk was, because he's such a character and acquired his wealth and bought SpaceX or set SpaceX up, he ended up being at the outer red part because that's how he got picked up. And then he ended up being in the very middle.
Okay.
It's very, very hard to be in the middle and at the edge at the same time.
Yeah, okay.
But there are people that do it. For example, Donald Trump. Because Donald Trump says some crazy things, so he's out there, he's on the very red tips, but he's also, everybody in the world knows him. Where you get lost is everywhere else, because if you're just saying sort of the same as everybody, then nobody pays attention. So therefore, what you could argue with Logitech is Logitech has two options. It can play in the middle as being the world's largest provider of VC gear, which is kind of interesting, although people don't necessarily associate you with that. Or the second part is you do things that are just stand out cool.
Yeah. We're about to become the first. So we are about to become the largest provider of VC gear based on all of our numbers that have come in recently.
Then it's how you articulate that, because human beings tend to look for the biggest thing and the most interesting thing, and not much in between exists anymore.
Yeah, okay.
So if you want limited attention in an oversaturated world, you've got to do something that's really, really obvious and interesting, or you've got to be the biggest, because people follow Tesla, for example, because it's so big and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. People only go to Facebook and Google because that's where you go.
Yeah, it's true.
If you wanted to tackle Google, there's no way you can do it anywhere other than at the red tip.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
So moving down to this next set of slides, here we look at disposable income per capita. And this is UK data, but it's broadly similar in the West. And what you see is for the last 50 years, income has gone up. It's plateaued, and it's very much likely to go down in terms of disposable per capita income, particularly in Europe. But the reason for this being is it kind of plays a really interesting part on decision making that we'll reflect upon, because the issue with anxiety in younger people is the perfect storm between having enough money and knowing what else you can do. Yeah. So what we tend to do is we look at how young people behave, and they're like, okay, well, I've seen what it's like living in South Central. I've seen what it's like living in Bel Air, for example. And I've seen what it's like living in Hollywood. And I know how these people live in the sunshine. They've got perfect feet, perfect face, perfect teeth, perfect money, perfect car, with a Ferrari, overlooking the sea, the Pacific Ocean. That's absolutely brilliant, because loads of people have got cameras, loads of stuff's loaded up to the internet. They've got the money to go there, and they only ever look at the things that are obscure.
Yeah, okay.
So when you look at this prospect theory, the sort of Kahneman theory, in terms of like human beings have an inbuilt bias to fear loss more than the reward of gain. So in other words, you're twice as likely to be upset by losing something as you are by finding something.
Yeah, fear of missing out.
All of that stuff. We now believe that this is probably grown to a factor of 8. So where it used to have a factor of 2 in terms of loss, now it's probably got a factor of 8. And what we find, particularly with young people, their drive and motivation is that they want to be YouTube stars, creators. They believe that they should be millionaires by the time that they're 16. They should have 20,000 people following them on Instagram. They should be living in California, because that's where the content comes from. And therefore what happens is, as they then turn around and look at themselves in a mirror as they're living in their, semi-detached bedroom in Stoke, what they then realize is that somehow their life was cheated. And they constantly spend the time thinking that I should have been this rather than I am that. And it's the pollution and the debilitating wealth of knowledge that they have, and they're only looking at the things that are interesting because they've got limited attention. They're looking at people's real lives, whereas when you and I grew up, I would watch the A-Team, and I'd watch the A-Team, and whilst I might go, man, I'd love to go to California and LA, that looks fun, I knew damn well that I couldn't, because I didn't have the money and it was a TV show. Now people do have the money and it's somebody's real life.
Yep. How's that guy got a Lamborghini in the sunshine and not me?
There's a guy, you got it. And there's a guy that goes around on TikTok, and he sort of, I can't remember what his name is, but he basically goes up to people in beautiful cars and he goes, excuse me, do you mind me asking what you do for a living? And the guy will go, yeah, I'm a YouTuber. And he's driving around in a £240,000 Lamborghini or Bugatti. And basically he goes, yeah, thank you very much. And they're beginning to recognize him, and he's beginning to get invited into the cars. And what you realize is this guy's going around with all of these young people thinking that that's the norm. So now people are looking at those people driving those cars, and they immediately assume that that's what they should be doing. So when they get into their 15-year-old Ford Focus, all they feel is cheated.
Yeah, I get you.
So what we've found now, last two, is that we've been looking at emotional and rational decision making across all of our clients and projects. Broadly, the blue line represents rational thinking and the red line emotional thinking. Yep. For all of our lives, for the most part, we've made choices that are rational. But again, this tipping point sits around about 2015, where the amount of data absolutely obscures our ability to cope with it. So take Brexit for an example. Very few people made the decision to vote with Brexit on a rational level, because no human being on planet Earth could figure out the fiscal mechanisms behind whether that's a good or bad decision. No. But what they would do is they'd see Nigel Farage and go, yeah, he's my kind of guy, isn't he? Yeah, 350 million a week sending to the EU. That sounds rubbish. I'm going to keep that. Because they never, ever converted the conversation into something where they actually said, is this true?
Yep.
Ricky Gervais said something really, really interesting about the same kind of times. He said that, as a comedian, he had a good perspective, but he said, the problem is that when your opinions overtake my facts, and because of the way now that people are allowed to post anything because of their YouTube blogs and their streamers and creators and X Factor and Pop Idol and all of these things, what they're beginning to say is like, well, yeah, I believe that this is what we should be doing as a country, rather than actually saying from a financial or fiscal perspective, this is what we should be doing. So rational conversations take time. They're complicated. Bearing in mind, nobody wants to pay attention to them anymore. People are completely overwhelmed. They're more worried about the risk than the reward. And they're only ever looking at the things that sit at the edge of the red bell curve. And that finally leads you to this, that actually the quality of decision-making is deteriorating, because if you oversaturate a human being with too much choice and too much complexity, the quality of their decision deteriorates. So I personally believe, and this is a bold statement, I think we've probably already exceeded the tipping point where human beings have made the best choices ever. I think probably we left that some time ago. So I think now, for the most part, our decision making is emotional, which basically means we're becoming more primate in our choices. Yep. Because if you look at what's happening to the planet and the way that we behave and our respect of law and order and the macroeconomics of the planet, most indicators would suggest that probably we made better choices going back to the 70s or 80s than necessarily we are today. Because when you give people too much information and too much choice, they don't make good decisions. Human beings are not infallible, and we're designed to cope with 4 or 5 pieces of information, not 25 trillion to the power of 17.
That's right. I've been listening to something recently, and it said some straight facts for me, which is fairly obvious things, but the individual man on the street should not be allowed to make any decisions that look global. And unfortunately, recently we've been able to do that. And the study that I was reading concentrated on the fact that humans were, to your point and the stuff that you sent me this morning, humans were designed to live in packs of maybe a couple of hundred and interact directly with those. And as soon as you bring a couple of thousand in, actually it becomes a problem at that human level because you can't interact properly. And it was saying exactly the same thing, that the emotional point of view has to come in, because you can't be rational about it anymore, because there are too many people that aren't like you, which means that your decision becomes more emotional because you want them to be more like you.
I don't even, you are right, because social copying is critical, but human beings from Australopithecus going back 4.5 billion years were designed around emotional decision making. Emotional decision making is embedded in all intelligent species. It's stuff that forces us to do things. You know, when you make a loud clap outside in the garden, the pigeons scatter. That's
Okay.
It's all inbuilt. The problem is that human beings have a limited capacity to cope at that high intellectual level. And that it's like a system 2 pipe that goes into your brain, and it's full. It's not just full, it's clogged. And when it's clogged, the only way left of nudging a human being is at the emotional level. So the path into the heart is much quicker, much more open. It's really quick. It guides us relatively well, because the pipe, the rational stuff is full. It's done. And therefore, when you look at complex decision making and executives in big organizations, people are beginning to make more and more emotional decision making, because broadly speaking, when it comes down to kind of like that rational, intelligent, argument, nobody's listening really. And that's why you end up with Brexit, and you end up with Trump, and you end up with the rise of the right wing in Germany and Le Pen in France, and you can see those things. That's why you end up with so much plastic in the ocean, because frankly, people don't even care about where they put their litter. That's why you end up with people that are now pushing back and arguing so damn hard against wearing a mask, despite the fact that coronavirus is such a challenge. There's all of these things, because ultimately how people feel is far more powerful in their choices than how people think.
Yeah, yep, I get you.
So in other words, going on the very macro level, and this isn't to be pessimistic because the human race has got to where it is and we've done ever so well, but if you're thinking about Logitech and how you then create a cohesion with a customer, broadly speaking, what you need to do is to measure the success of the meeting based upon not the rational exchange of specs, but probably more over the emotional connection that you have, because that's going to become more and more pervasive in decision making in the future.
Yeah. Yep.
So I can send this slide, I can send this slide to you.
That would be great.
And then you have it. But that's sort of the right thing. And when we talk about kids in school suffering from depression, which is really, really challenging, and we're dealing with a lot of complex issues, and we're dealing with kids that can't pay attention to things, and we do quite a lot of work. It's like, for the most part, it comes down to some component on that slide. Because simply put, we're not designed to cope with this. And then when you look at technology, and I'm relatively smart, but it's like, because we can make things complicated, we do. And engineers like making things complicated. And I think I told you this last time we spoke, I bought a 1990s cassette deck.
You did.
And it's
controls.
Got dedicated buttons on it. And the thing is, from a complexity perspective, it's really, really powerful. So there's a guy called Don Norman who wrote about the difference between confusion and complexity. And, things can be complex, but they shouldn't be confusing. That's the issue. Like, if it's got multiple functionalities, sometimes they are complex. They have to be. A fighter jet has to be complex, but it shouldn't be confusing. And then you start to think about where confusion comes from, and you start to play all of the stuff to do with intuition. It's very, very hard to separate the user interfaces between Google and Apple now, really.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and Microsoft, because Bing looks like virtually identical to Google. And just the way that Tesco's own cola looks like, it's red and it kind of looks a little bit like Coke. Just where Coke's now done low sugar and it's a red can with black writing on it, because what you're trying to do effectively is to make it so marginal that people don't even notice the difference between the white writing and the black writing.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I did notice that recently, that there's no silver cans with red writing in the shop at the moment. The shop up the road has got a selection of red cans with black writing or a green strip around the top.
Yep. And that's to make people try to divert out of the full sugar product into a saccharin-based product.
Yeah.
Then if you think about it, and whether this is true or not, I can't say, but there's an awful lot of stuff out there that talks about whether artificial sweeteners are good for you.
Mm.
And high fructose corn syrup is not good for you, and a whole bunch of other things. But because people's emotional decision making is like, I like sugary drinks because that's what prehistoric man wanted, high calorie, high sugar drinks, trying to get them to read the labels on the back.
Yeah.
There's only 8% of people that read the medication labels. 92% of people will swallow the pills without looking. We're worried about taking COVID vaccinations, despite the fact that aspirin's more dangerous for us.
Yeah, indeed. Indeed.